I grew up in northern Ontario in a town where the population was mostly middle-aged to elderly couples. My good friend Hank lived down the street and we would spend a lot of time outdoors together. We loved walking along the old logging roads that ran through the forest, which were all no longer in use and we would never see anyone traveling them. The older we got, however, the less excited we got about spending hours walking along the old logging roads. By the time we were seniors in high school, we hadn't been to them in over a year. There was one night, however, the night the events of this story take place. It was late one Friday night and Hank was over at my house. We were just hanging out and watching some TV. It had been an extremely uneventful evening and Hank was all out of sorts because of his recent breakup. I was growing more agitated as I tried to engage him in whatever show we were watching or conversation, but he was just acting all distant. So eventually I just stood up and declared we were going for a drive. He wasn't enthusiastic about my spontaneous excursion idea, but he didn't object either. So we hopped in my old Tacoma and I started driving away from town square. It was almost midnight and the roads were dead. We were just cruising with the windows down, listening to some mellow music on low volume and enjoying the night air. It wasn't until the houses started becoming more sparse as I was heading out towards the old logging roads that Hank asked where we were going, and I told him. He grunted in reply, but I knew this was going to help clear his head regardless. I turned off the main road onto the old covered bridge and finally out to the old dirt roads. I was driving down the middle of the road because we'd never seen anyone out here before, let alone at midnight. Not even ATVers, not even Ministry of National Resource guys, no one. So you can understand why we both immediately got a little shaken as we rounded a bend to see truck lights off down an old ATV trail. Neither of us said a word as we approached the ATV trail. I dimmed my headlights and slowed to a crawl as we were parallel to the mouth of the trail. We both stared out the window at the truck. It looked to me like they were stuck because the truck was running and the lights were on. Hank turned to face me and said, "You think they're bogged down or something?" I shrugged and said probably. We both agreed that since we were already stopped by them, we should get out and see if they needed any help. I put my Tacoma in park, but left the engine running. Let me reiterate how absolutely just downright strange it was for us to see another vehicle on this road at this time of night. So the whole thing was just quite frankly giving me the creeps a little. So I decided at the first sign of trouble, I wasn't going to be fiddling with my keys for a minute in my truck. We approached the truck in the trail. It was an old, probably like 90s Chevy CK that looked like it had seen better days. The first thing I picked up on was this awful smell permeating the air. It was so bad, I swear to God, Hank and I both gagged when we first smelt it. As we got closer, we found there was nobody in the truck. The back gate was down and there were a ton of shovels resting in the bed, and some dark pile near the back. That was where the stench seemed to be coming from. I really was starting to not like this at all. I looked over at Hank, ready to get us out of there, and saw he was staring off into the woods. I followed his gaze, and there were multiple lights of headlamps out there in the woods. To my utter shock, Hank called out to them. "Hey, we're just checking in on you. Everything alright?" Almost instantly, the lights went out. I actually felt shivers down my spine as everything went silent. There was no response. "Dude, what the fuck?" I whispered. I think we both had the same thought process at that point. The shovels and dark objects in the truck bed, the horrible smell, the fact we'd never seen anyone else out here. And then that's when something else hit me that was just a nail on the coffin. The truck didn't even have any goddamn license plates on it. I had a shotgun in my truck that I kept there at all times, and at this point we were both probably a 25-meter dash from it. I made split-second eye contact with Hank before we both just booked it towards my truck. I shouted at him to grab the gun from the back as we jumped in. I threw it in drive before Hank was even inside fully. I couldn't floor it, otherwise that'd be a guaranteed accident, so I just started driving as fast as I thought I possibly could, probably like 40 miles per hour. I felt my heart sink as I heard the CK fly out the mouth of the trail and start ripping it towards me. Hank was screaming for me to drive faster as he was loading the gun, and as I watched the blinding headlights flooding my rearview mirror, I genuinely felt as though I was on the brink of death. With no other option, I began to accelerate faster. My truck was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we were taking corners at damn near 60 miles per hour, and they were still on my ass. I don't know what to call what happened next. Call it some stroke of luck, or call it a miracle by God. But for whatever reason, as I was gunning it down this old crappy road, I saw our chaser's headlights move out of sight from my rearview mirror. I even turned around in my seat to get a better look. They were turning off the road and down some other path for whatever reason. And in the blink of an eye, we rounded another bend and they were completely out of sight. I found my way straight back onto the main road and instantly we headed to the police department and told them everything. They sent a couple cars out to the location I had described. With not much else to do after giving our stories, I dropped Hank off and went home. Needless to say, I didn't get any sleep that night. I found out the next day that they had actually caught the guys. For some reason, those idiots didn't even flee the scene after chasing us off. Apparently, there was some biker group that had been on the run from police a few counties over after some big drug bust. They were trying to dump chemical canisters used for their drug operations, and in the process, they got into some kind of conflict with each other that ended up with 2 of them being shot dead. So along with dumping their drug barrels, they were also planning on burying their 2 friends' bodies out there. All I can say in retrospect was I'm glad I left my Tacoma's engine running, and that they decided to give up the chase. I think I can say confidently this whole incident got Hank's mind off his breakup for a while. Being a teenager in an extremely small rural town had its ups and downs. There were a lot of cool spots to hang out since we were pretty deep into the countryside, but the downside was we were at a time in our lives where we had pretty much exhausted every spot in our little town. Now this stopped becoming an issue once we all had our licenses, but before that we were low on solid hangout spots. As a result, we would often ride our bikes as far as we could out into the surrounding areas to find new places to chill. This one night I was with my 2 friends Dorian and AJ. We had just grabbed a bite to eat at some burger joint we frequented and then rode our bikes around the east side of our town until it had gotten dark. Then we just posted up near some creek we also used to frequent. Dorian came up with the idea to walk alongside the creek since it had risen significantly due to recent rainfall. With a lack of anything more exciting to do before we'd have to head home for the night, we leaned our bikes against the fence and began walking along the creek, just shooting the shit about anything and everything. We were pleasantly surprised to see the creek led to a huge tunnel that was on the side of an embankment. None of us had any idea this thing existed, and as a result we were eager to check it out as a new possible chill spot for our friend group. So we headed in. The ceiling of the tunnel was just high enough so that we didn't have to bend over, but we weren't able to walk upright. I'd have to walk with my head ducked down. The farther we walked in, the more windy the tunnel got. There was also a pungent odor in the air. I couldn't exactly place what the smell was, but it wasn't a pleasant smell at all. The foul smell and the strain on my neck was becoming a bit much after 5 or so minutes of exploring. I was about to ask my friends to turn around when AJ swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt. In the distance ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo through the tunnel. We all looked at each other, fear in our eyes. AJ continued towards the sounds. I looked at Dorian and considered turning around, but I don't think either of us thought it was right to leave AJ alone. So we followed him. Finally, we rounded a corner and the horrible smell surged. I heard the sound of flies, and I finally realized what the smell was. It smelled like rotting meat down there. AJ gasped and stepped backwards to align himself with us. In front of us, in the middle of the tunnel, was a dead deer. It had a huge gash on its stomach, and innards were spilled out onto the floor, staining the concrete. AJ doubled over and began to dry heave on the spot. Then we heard whispering from somewhere in the dark. Dorian moved his flashlight to the side of the corpse, where it fell upon a man standing towards the wall with his head down. He was wearing a bright green t-shirt stained with what I assumed was blood, and ripped beige shorts. He was barefoot and his feet seemed damaged. He was jerking sporadically and mumbling something without looking up, even as the flashlight washed over him. We stared in shock for a few seconds before he began to move. He looked up at us with this haunting grin and said, "You guys here for the feast?" We turned around and bolted. I ended up behind my friends as we were running out of there. Being at the back was terrifying, as I kept imagining someone grabbing me from behind. But I didn't turn around once as we ran back the way we came in. A couple months after we visited that spot, we found out some maintenance guys doing a routine check on the tunnel had found the guy and had him removed by the cops. He was a homeless man living off the wildlife around the tunnel. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases from eating raw meat for so long. This had only exacerbated his poor mental condition. It all started in 4th period trigonometry class. My high school ran on a block schedule, meaning I didn't go to all 6 classes per day. So that Friday, 4th period was my first class of the day. I showed up about 10 minutes late, as I usually did in the morning, and made my way to my table group. I greeted the guy I sat next to, whose name was Jack. I would consider myself friends with Jack, even though we had never seen each other outside of school, because I had gone to school with him for 2 years at this point and had him in a number of my classes. We got to talking about random stuff, as we usually did to kill time. At one point, Jack got to babbling about some place near where he lived. At first I wasn't really listening, but my interest peaked when he got to talking about the weird shit that goes on in the area. He was talking about some tiny town called Port Costa and what he described as the middle of nowhere, near where he lived in Martinez. This is all in the East Bay, by the way. Jack was talking about the weird people who lived there, the ghost stories, and how he thought the place was run by some Woodlands cult. Obviously, I didn't believe a word of it, but I was down to go check it out with him that night. Plus, he said he'd bring some weed. When school let out that day, I called my parents to tell them I was going to go hang out with Jack. Since I lived about 40 minutes away from my school, I didn't see the point in driving back home, since Martinez was the same distance in the opposite direction from school. I followed Jack's Jeep back to his house. We hung out at his house for about an hour until 2 other guys from our school he invited to come showed up, who were Charlie and Sean. We just all chilled together until it got decently dark at 9 p.m. Then we hopped in Jack's Jeep to go drive down to the place. Jack wasn't kidding when he said this place was in the middle of nowhere. He was taking us down some windy 2-lane road that ran alongside nothing but mountain on one side, and the Carquinez Strait on the other. Eventually he told us we were there. We were driving down some dark road that was even narrower than the previous one, with a house maybe every 60 yards or so. Other than that, it was just forest. He then turned off down some road he said he had heard lots of stories about. There were no houses on this road at all. Jack found a good spot to pull his Jeep over, and he said that we should go walk around. So first we lit a joint and passed it around for a bit, and then got out. Just as we got out, we noticed what looked like flashlight beams coming down the road towards us. I was about to call out to them, but Jack started freaking out and told me not to. I thought he was just being a pussy, but Charlie started agreeing with him too. So we just got back in the Jeep and decided we'd drive further down the road. There wasn't enough room for Jack to turn around, so we'd have to drive right past the flashlights. As Jack started the car and pulled back onto the road, we could see what looked like one person now standing off to the side of the road. We all fell silent as we passed him. Passing him felt like an eternity because we couldn't have been going more than 15 miles per hour. He looked pretty average, except for the fact he had eyes opened wide as saucers and his jaw was hanging open. I was sitting in the passenger seat, therefore I was closest to him, and his wide eyes were locked on me the whole time. As soon as we passed him, Jack said that was creepy as shit. Charlie and Sean sort of nervously chuckled. I was able to laugh about it a little later, even though I kept thinking back to that guy's creepy face. The three of them wanted to smoke some more, so once we were a minute farther up the road, Jack pulled over again to roll another joint. The thing about weed, and the reason I don't really enjoy smoking it as much as I say I do, is because it admittedly makes me paranoid as hell. So while we were pulled over on that road, I kept glancing out the back window, just expecting to see that guy with his hanging jaw popping out again. I tried to settle down as I took a couple hits off the joint. All of a sudden, our good time was interrupted by deafening bangs. At first, I had no idea what was going on, but I snapped out of it as soon as I heard Charlie and Sean screaming in the back seat. The guy's face was inches from the window to my right. He was banging on the window with one hand balled in a fist and jiggling the door handle with the other, his mouth still open in an O shape. I stared right into his eyes. It didn't even feel like a person was looking back at me, if that makes any sense. His eyes just looked completely devoid of life. Jack peeled out of there. He probably drove 90 miles per hour on the way back to his house. We were all thoroughly freaked the fuck out. I was completely sober at this point as well. I don't know what that guy wanted. He could have just been some crackhead, but maybe he had ill intentions. No matter how scared shitless I was at the time, at this point I consider myself lucky I have such a terrifying story to tell. Nevertheless, I don't think the memory of that guy's eyes is ever going to leave my system.